Good afternoon, and welcome to this Mile End Institute webinar entitled Whatever It Takes, the Policy Implications of Supporting Ukraine. My name is James Strong, and I'm Reader in British Politics and Foreign Policy in the School of Society and Environment here at Queen Mary University of London, and I will be your host this afternoon. The Mile End Institute is Queen Mary's Centre for the Study and Public Discussion of British Politics, Political History and Public Policy. It was founded in 2015 by Lord Peter Hennessy to bring together academics, politicians, policymakers and the public to explore the major challenges facing British politics, policymaking and public life. The Mile End Institute organises a series of public events, all of which are free, including the Distinguished Hennessy Lectures, one of which inspired this webinar, an In Conversation series, which has featured the likes of Tony Blair, Diane Abbott and Jacob Rees-Mogg, and panel discussions on the most substantial issues of our times. If you haven't signed up to the mailing list yet, please do so. You can use the link that is about to appear in the chat box. This webinar follows on from the Hennessy lecture given a few weeks ago of the same title by Sir Lawrence Freedman, in which he made a series of arguments about how the ongoing war in Ukraine has influenced military technology and tactics, international and domestic political orders, and questions of alliances and security guarantees at the international level. In today's session, our panelists will be talking about the UK's commitment to Ukraine, and in particular what this commitment means for UK defence spending, tax policy and energy security, UK political parties and competition between them, the UK's relations with the EU, NATO and the United States, and the UK's preparedness for future conflict. We're very fortunate to be joined by a stellar panel of experts to offer their insights on these vital questions. Evie Aspinall is Director of the British Foreign Policy Group, an independent, non-partisan think tank focusing on the intersection between domestic and foreign policy. Her primary research interests are domestic consent for foreign policy, the UK's role in the world, and challenges posed by the UK's strategic rivals. Patrick Porter is Professor of International Security and Strategy at the University of Birmingham and a Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute. He is the author of 5 books on war, strategy and international relations, including Blunder, Britain's War in Iraq, The False Promise of Liberal Order, and How to Survive a Hostile World, Power, Politics and the Case for Realism. Elke Schwarz is Professor of Political Theory at Queen Mary University of London. She is Vice Chair of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control and an Associate of the Imperial War Museum. She is the author of Death Machines, The Ethics of Violent Technologies. I've asked each of our panelists to speak for 5 to 6 minutes in response to the themes of the webinar, and we'll then have a discussion. Audience members can use the Q&A function to submit questions at any time, and I'll select some to pose to the panelists. So welcome to all of you to this session. Welcome to our panelists. Thank you very much for joining us. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Evie Aspinall for our first input. Evie.
Thank you very much. And as James says, my focus is very much in general on the intersection between the domestic and the international. So I wanted to use my remarks to focus particularly on the public perspective and that question of what does it mean in practice and how ready are the public for some of those potential challenges of supporting Ukraine and conflict and security more generally. And so my kind of broad overarching kind of sentiment is that the public isn't ready for many of the trade-offs and many of the what-ifs of supporting Ukraine. And I think this becomes most clear when you talk about defence spending. So we do lots of public opinion research, and our most recent survey came out in July this year. And it found that 71% of Britons believe that the UK should increase defence spending to 3%, either now or over the next few years by the next parliament. So that sounds pretty promising. But when you start asking about trade-offs, that support really falls away. So 60% of Brits would oppose increasing defence spending if it requires reducing spending on the NHS. 47% would oppose it if you had to spend less on education. 46% would oppose it if you had to spend less on welfare. Taxes, increasing taxes is the least controversial, but it's still the case that more Brits would oppose this than support it. So in practice, if you look at kind of government spending, there are very few areas left where the public would support reduced spending somewhere else to fund increased defence spending. What is also particularly challenging is that a lot of the public perspective is driven by self-interest. So younger Britons, for example, are more willing to accept cuts to the NHS to fund defence spending than older Britons are because they themselves are less reliant on the NHS. Meanwhile, older Britons are more willing to accept tax increases because they are less likely to be facing many of those tax increases for the long term than younger people. And so with the aid budget already severely reduced, we're looking at some very difficult challenges which will annoy different demographics differently to fund a lot of this kind of increase in focus on national security and defence. And when it comes to Ukraine specifically, support from Britons has actually been pretty resilient. It's been surprisingly high, and more so than in much of the rest of Europe. There's a couple of drivers of this. That's some of the personal effects that people have felt. So that's, they've seen their own energy bills increase, cost of living increase, and they've drawn the links. It also links to kind of broader anti-Russian feeling in the UK, linked to the Salisbury poisoning, the dominance of Russian oligarchs in the UK, and also this wider sense you find among the British public that the UK should lead. But this year, in the first year since 2022, the polling has shown that actually the Ukraine support for Ukraine is no longer seen as a primary source of pride for the British public. It's not seen as a top priority. And indeed, we're seeing that trust in Russia, while incredibly low, is improving. So in 2022, 91% of Brits distrusted Russia. Now that's down at 78%. Obviously, still a very high number, but the numbers are falling and interest and support for Ukraine is falling. The challenge as this conflict goes on then is maintaining momentum and interest, especially when people are instinctively opposed to spending money on defence. And I think there are two particularly profound challenges that we should be focusing on. One is that Britons don't feel a sense of threat in the way that they should. So actually, again, our research shows that this year, Brits feel more safe than they have at any point since the COVID pandemic, before the COVID pandemic. So people felt very, very unsafe during COVID because it was very immediate, it felt very real. But a lot of these kind of longer term, further away, more distant threats, which are clearly, real, don't feel particularly real to the average Brit because what they focus on are the most immediate personal risks. So that's things like knife crime, health pandemics, those things that they can see immediately to them. And conflicts abroad often don't feel that immediate. The second is the generational divide in security concerns, and these are particularly profound when it comes to Ukraine. So while 90% of 56 to 65-year-olds distrust Russia, just 58% of 26 to 35-year-olds do. And as a result, while 60% of over 66s view continued Russian aggression as a top 3 threat to the UK, only 25% of 18 to 25-year-olds do. There are a couple of drivers of this. Partly that's a broader concern about defence spending and national security among young people, but it's also particularly driven by a sense of hypocrisy among young people about how much support Ukraine has received compared to other crises, not least Gaza, also Sudan. And so for those young people, we're seeing a further distance from the willingness to make some of these sacrifices that are required to support Ukraine for the long term. But I always try to end on a positive note. And I do think that in reality, whilst the Ukraine conflict still feels quite far away, if for some reason it was massively to scale up, if Putin was to invade another country in Europe, particularly one that feels closer to home for many Brits, I do think people would step up. We've seen that in World War I, we saw it in World War II, that people do in the moment of urgent crisis, they do step up. But the challenge is that in the world where we're looking at more grey zone warfare, with more of a need for a whole of society response to conflict and security issues, the challenge that we face is that we need to invest in the long term. And that doesn't feel immediate enough to the public, and therefore they're not prioritising and investing in it. So that's the public perspective as a starting point for the conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you for trying at least to end on a positive note. No doubt continuing in a positive note, I'm going to hand over next to Patrick Porter. Patrick.
Well, good afternoon. Wildly unfair that I have to follow an act like that, but I'll do my best. I want to put 3 simple points on the table. It's pretty bleak, pretty dark, but I do try and offer something constructive that we can all do that's real. Those points are as follows. First, and this is a very simple point, we, the non-US European states, are helping Ukraine in order to help ourselves. This is not charity. I think that's a very important thing to start with. Secondly, this means that I think we should commit to being Ukraine's arsenal for the future, but without promising to do what we haven't been willing to do thus far. And thirdly, the most important new thing we can do, the most important additional element to this coalition campaign, is to give something to Ukraine that we haven't done so far, which is to give them clarity. So let me just briefly explain each of these points. We're not standing with Ukraine, as so many people say. Despite all the flags and all the emblems, we're not standing with them, we're behind them. We're supporting them from a remove at arm's length. I think it's prudent to do so. I think we have an interest in Ukraine, a real interest, but not an unlimited interest. And we're in the business of advancing our own security interests for our own citizens, and that's a morally serious thing. But we've got to be super real about what we think exactly is at stake. Why does this matter at all? And that's important because Russia regards itself as having vital interest at stake. What's my evidence for that? The fact that they've been willing to fight an attritional grinding war for 3 years, and we have not. Our interest is helping Ukraine do something it's willing to do, which is to bleed Russia, to make it expensive for Russia to expand, harder to devour a neighboring state, and therefore less likely to enlarge its predatory ambitions to NATO's eastern flank and get too close to the heartland, which is Central Europe, Germany, and the balance of power in Europe. What's important here is that Ukraine coincides with that point and is willing to fight. And by being willing to fight with our help, it's buying valuable time. Time is a very important commodity here for a number of reasons. We need time to prepare for a larger era of the return of industrial scale war, out in the open, in-your-face war, not just hybrid war, an era of nuclear coercion, and the frightening reality that we might be facing in the long term, or shorter than that, a potential US drawdown from its transatlantic commitments, or at least some kind of burden shift. With all the loss of extended deterrence or military enablers and all of those things. So we need time to build capability to have a Europe-led or a coalition-led defense in this region. And what we should do, I think, is align what we do with what's at stake. What's at stake is important but limited. Therefore, what we should do is substantial but limited. To paraphrase the accountant, show me what you're willing to bleed for, or ultimately what you're willing to risk nuclear war for, and I'll show you your vital interests. Keir Starmer has said our interests are vital, but he doesn't behave like it. Second, that means being Ukraine's arsenal for the future. It's a hard truth, but something we have learned unambiguously is that only Ukraine will fight for Ukraine, as the past 3 years demonstrate. That is Ukraine's political reality. It would be imprudent for us to promise to do more than that sometime in the future, at another time, at a better moment. Firstly, because Russia demonstrably has a greater resolve than we do over this issue, whereas Ukraine has a maximal resolve to keep fighting. Any attempt at direct intervention, like no-fly zones, peacekeeping, tripwire, or reassurance forces, would run up against that reality. Either Russia would test such forces and they would fold, or we would get into an escalating crisis with a power that's willing to take much graver risks than we are. Worse, we would do so without the backup, the strategic reserve of the United States being able to come in to tip the balance once the tripwire is, as it were, switched. So we should only take such risks where our interests are vital and our resolve is undoubtedly strong, and that is not in Ukraine. Also, that's bad because it would deceive Ukraine itself. It would be a very unfair kind of love, this dalliance with our future commitment to their security. And what I've just said, most of it is just a very stark, unpleasant way of restating what is in fact our default position. The problem is our rhetoric. The problem is the gap between what we say we might do in the future and what we're actually willing to do. Lastly, and I'm sorry to go on, the most important thing we can do is give Ukraine clarity about our intentions and our commitments. Ukraine has suffered greatly in this war. I would never want to understate that, but it has not maximized its own mobilization. For it to go the distance in what has become a long war where defenses are now deep and dug in and decisive offensive breakthroughs are elusive, Ukraine will have to focus laser-like on its manpower, on its combat power. For example, turning territorial defense brigades into fully fledged mechanized brigades, and all of the armored vehicles and the electronic warfare and the artillery. We can help them technically, financially, logistically, and by giving them the tools, but only they will do the job. rather than what we have been doing, which is to conduct this sort of unrealistic dalliance with kind of providing guarantees and hoping that if we make a commitment, the deterrence will hold, and Russia, which we regard as pathologically aggressive, suddenly becomes risk averse in a thing which it regards as more vital than we do. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Always got to end with that problem. Maybe this is all wrong, right? It's not unknown. Maybe our interests are in fact vital in Ukraine, as Keir Starmer says. Vital, which means necessary for life. Maybe it's maximal. Maybe all we hold and care for is on the line. If that's the case, intervene now. Do it properly, do it intensively on a scale, and be willing to escalate all the way to the potential for all-out nuclear war. Because the wolf is at Ukraine's throat now. And if that sounds too drastic, if that sounds a little extreme, even if you're on the maximalist side of the argument with Phillips O'Brien and Elliot Cohen, if all you're willing to actually say, oh, we should have no-fly zones, or we should kind of do this or that, but not go all the way, then implicitly you're agreeing with me that our interests are limited. I think we can do those things. I think that we can do those things with the budget ceilings that Evie's talked about, with the limits on political will, but it's time to all get real. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and very useful to hear a call for getting real from one of our leading realist scholars working in the UK right now. Finally, over to Elke Schwarz. Elke.
Thanks so much. Thank you both. It's even harder to finish both of you, to follow both of yours. Very illuminating discussions. So my expertise for the last decade is in military technology and the ethics thereof. But as of recently, I've turned my attention to the broader spectrum of what it takes to win, fight, succeed in a war ethically. And as we probably all know, there's some factors that relate to military technology, and there are some factors that are political and also economic. So I've turned my attention very much to the political economy that underpins not just this conflict, but generally the weapons industry and the new defense players as we see them, and on which the UK seems to bet, to use a term that is appropriate for that domain, seems to bet for its future. So really the phrase, whatever it takes in the relationship to Ukraine, has a cousin, and that is as long as it takes, which refers to a soundbite of Starmer's in pledging to give £3 billion to Ukraine annually in military support. This pledge was made in 2024. And so far, since the start of this campaign, 2022, the UK has pledged just short of £22 billion in support to the Ukraine, half of which of that has been pledged for military assistance. Most of this money has been gifted. Some will be paid back through loans, through finance otherwise through frozen Russian assets. In order to provide military assistance, the UK has entered into various new defense-related contracts with some defense technology startups like Endural, which provides loitering munitions, or the German startup Helsing, which provides strike drones, and also various artificial intelligence, digital targeting web infrastructure providers. So software providers for systems that are designed to respond not just to the current Russian threat, but also to the defense requirements of the future. And the hopes are really that these investments bear out in the longer run, especially as Ukraine is often lauded to be ushering in a particularly innovative era in military technology. I'll come back to this at the end, but I want to just briefly stay with the economic factors for the moment. So in order to understand how long it might take, we can't just look to military hardware. Of course, they're important, weapons are important, but it's often not enough to determine how long a conflict will take. So we must take into account the Russian economic conditions. So early on in the war, it was assumed that heavy sanctions would cripple the Russian economy relatively quickly, and that would force an end to the occupation also relatively swiftly. So the EU really saw itself as a major player in that. Now, none of that happened. Russia has indeed benefited from a war-driven economic growth, Keynesianism, in the past years, especially in the last 3 years, actually. 2 years actually. That relates to a certain underutilization of the Russian manufacturing economy in the past decade leading up to this current campaign, which has provided room for growth. There were some other factors that led to a strengthening of the economy under wartime conditions. So that includes the restructuring of the manufacturing sector towards defense, the reorientation towards defense, the emerging and proliferation of new defense manufacturing sectors, so the mass production of attritable drones, for example. Those have enhanced the economy in Russia. A higher demand for labor, as well as a high sign-on bonus for military service, has given uplift to wages, which in turn has enriched, actually, specifically the lowest 10% of the population, lowest 10% in the sense that they're the low-income earners. So they have seen the highest uplift in wages in real terms. And with that, more taxes were flowing back into the economy. So that all of that has given a wartime uplift to the economy. And of course, especially revenues from oil exports have also not really suffered. In fact, there was a big upswing in 2024, propped up by countries like India and China. And even the UK too has not fully divested from Russian oil. There's a certain loophole that enables the import of Russian oil, which is refined in India. And some estimations of like 5% of UK oil comes via this route. EU sanctions are certainly not sharp enough, and the UK only joined the US last week in placing sharper sanctions on Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. So some of this wartime uplift is financed through shifting budgets. It's not quite clear how exactly it works, at least not to me. I'm open to any information, of course. Some is financed through credits, and there's a fair bit of occlusion exactly what the balance is between the two of them and how it exactly works. And some suggest that really the entire wartime economy and its uplift is kind of a house of cards, which is supposed to be tumbling down any minute now. Others suggest that Russia has reserves which can keep the uplift alive for a little while longer. But the crucial point is it is difficult to destabilize Russia internally and disrupt the war effort there if the economy is strong and people are better off. Of course, as it is the case with all wartime economies, there's a distinct limit to this, and especially those aspects that are financed through expensive credits pose potential significant risk for an economic, not collapse, but certainly a severe contraction. This will then affect the populations, and this will then affect the support for war. So I think this economic dimension is not unimportant when we look at the bigger picture and think through whatever it takes or how long it takes. So what does that mean for the UK? Well, the UK seems to be determined to fashion its economy along wartime dynamics, kind of preemptively. The idea really is, when you look at the Strategic Defense Review and the Defense Industrial Strategy, and also some parts of the Modern Industrial Strategy and the National Security Strategy, the idea is that wartime economies foster innovation, and innovation has a kind of like a down-the-line payoff in terms of economic growth. So this wartime innovation growth model rests on an assumption that military efforts usually produce new technologies that then find new and innovative uses in civilian sectors, and that they then produce growth in non-military form further down the line once the war has ended. So that is all part usually of this model of wartime economy uplift. But what we are investing in at the moment is a little bit the opposite in the UK context, but in the broader context, US context as well. Often the companies producing new military technologies, those startups that I mentioned, some of these technologies do come from the civilian sector. So you have private companies kind of dictating the pace and mode of innovation. In recent years, it was mostly drones, mass-produced drones. Mass is always the word here. Initially, the focus was very much on aerial drones. Now everybody seems to be focusing on maritime drones, and associated manufacture. Autonomy in manufacture is the latest kind of investment craze, I want to say. So securing these supply chains, but also securing manufacture. Now, many observers have commented that although the Ukraine is often lauded as an incubator of cutting-edge new technology, actually a lot of the technology used is quite low tech itself. And the imitation iteration cycles are so fast that nothing ends up being particularly decisive for a longer period of time. It also seems to be the case that everybody seems to be doing kind of the same type of technologies at the moment. However, the UK seems to be set on shifting its bet for economic growth on defense spending and wartime economy investments, but then during peacetime. In some ways, this feels to me a bit like this, these reviews that we've seen come out in the last few months are in themselves betting on war, at least creating an economy that is then dependent on war, and in doing so emulates a little bit the rules that Russia has set for the game. Now, the scholarship on the possibility for growth through defense dividends or wartime spending is divided. It's not conclusive. There are a lot of factors that play into it. And with the inclusion of a reliance on especially international venture capital investments for the build out of this peacetime war economy or defense dividend, I do worry that the UK might make itself dependent on protracted wars for economic growth. In other words, then whatever it takes might mean as long as it takes, which might mean a very, very long time. But the benefits to both the Ukraine and the UK populations may be diminishing as time passes and as strategies are not adjusted. And I leave it here. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for the questions coming in so far. I am keeping an eye on them. If you could put the questions in the Q&A, it then gives me a nice little tick box that I can work off from the other screen. But I am also looking at the ones that have come through on the chat as well. So the first thing I wanted to touch on, which each of the panelists has touched on this to some extent. Those of you in the audience who are familiar with the UK's approach to international strategy, national security, will not be hugely surprised by the idea that there might be a mismatch between the stated goals of the strategy and the actual willingness to pay for it. But it seems to me, and it's definitely something that Lawrence Friedman talked about in his lecture as well, that one of the key questions here is the ambiguity in the phrase whatever it takes or however long it takes, which is the question of what is it? What is the it we are talking about when we say whatever it takes or how long it takes? From a British perspective, what is the end game that we're looking for? And I'm going to ask Patrick to respond to that first so we can shake the order up a bit. Patrick.
A decisive end game is not likely, because that's not the way this kind of war works. It's more likely to be in a very rough speaking sense, some version of the Korean Peninsula, some tacit agreements, some ultimately two sides more or less accepting the ground they occupy for the moment. I don't think we'll ever see Kiev ceding Crimea or the Donbass, and I don't think Russia will cede its conquests either. But from the British perspective, the national interest is making sure that whenever we get to that point, Russia is depleted and less able to predate and menace upon countries further west or north of Ukraine, and that the war is painful enough to make it harder for Russia to threaten the balance of power in Europe, and hopefully to build in a deterrent, like with, say, the Soviet-Finnish war in 1939, that Russia will make some gains, but they will be ferociously expensive. So in that sense, whatever it takes means patience over time. But notice what also argued that whatever it takes shouldn't be the attitude with regard to what risks we take. I could go on all day, but I probably won't.
Great, thank you very much. Evie, what is the end game for Britain from your perspective?
The thing to me, I think there's two questions in it, because there's one which is what does the UK want the end game to do? What is it hoping to achieve? And to me, that's kind of a negotiated settlement that has Ukrainian sovereignty. It removes a threat of future aggression. In a really ideal world, the Ukraine would still have a kind of European tilt to it. It would be, involved in economic and security structures. That part probably not hugely likely, but that would be kind of the ideal scenario. I think, as Patrick touches on, that isn't hugely likely. It's going to be a much more piecemeal approach, which is we'll stay where we are for now. And for Kyiv, the real big priority is making sure it doesn't lose territory. And the question then is, how aligned is whatever it takes with that kind of end goal? The reality is, most important probably, is where is the US in that conversation? Because if for the US the settlement has to involve giving up territory because that's how you get a conclusion sooner, then the reality is this isn't a war that can be fought for the long term without the support of the US. The Europe isn't going to be enough in the long term to protect Ukraine. And so it's a much more challenging conversation is how do these kind of align? And I think there are three parts that we have to think about is like whatever it takes. That's partly military, and that's, multi-billion-pound aid and military support for the long term. We've done some of that, but we've not done enough to actually enable Ukraine to win the war, and neither has the rest of Europe and neither has the US. So we haven't really done whatever it takes there. Domestically, we have done quite a lot to kind of adjust our industrial policies to kind of enable us to move quickly to build up capabilities, etc. We've done a bit of that. And diplomatically, I think you could say we've done a lot to kind of use up political capital trying to push for and support Ukraine, particularly when it comes to the US. But I don't think we have done whatever it takes so far. And I think we know what we want the end game to be. But the reality is that it's not just us or Ukraine or even Russia involved in the conversation. It's what the US wants that will ultimately dictate where the end game falls.
Great, thank you. And Elke, same question. What is the it here?
I think it's a bit of a phrase that allows for multiple interpretations, right? I don't think anybody knows the whatever part of it either. Like, what does it take? Whatever it takes, right? So I think it's not really something that can easily be answered. So whatever it takes to win is not likely to be a decisive sort of situation, as Patrick had already pointed out. Whatever it takes to end hostilities is also going to be a protracted kind of environment. So I think the phrase is not very useful because it allows for just too varied an interpretation. And it also allows for varied interests to be attached to whatever interpretation one might have for whatever it is that it takes, and towards what. So I don't really have a definitive answer. I'm observing at the moment various dynamics as it relates to the weapons industry, as it relates to the narratives about the future of Ukraine, and as it relates to international geopolitical trends and tendencies. And I have to really, I have no choice but come to the conclusion that it's so far, it's not particularly coherent what we have done and what has been done in relation to ending hostilities and providing an environment in which a repeat of 2014, right, cannot happen again. So, this is a very, very long-winded way of saying, I actually don't know.
Great, thank you. I'm going to respond to some of these things. I'm going to try and bring in some of the questions that have been raised so far. Something that occurs to me right away is there a sense in which an end of the war is maybe not in Britain's interest so much as it continuing in its current form, in which it is distracting Russia, it is taking up resources, and it's not spreading beyond the confines of Ukraine? Is there a sense in which the war continuing essentially as it is in Ukraine is actually not a bad outcome, which then makes some of these other questions, some of these other comments quite interesting? I also wanted to bring in the dimension of NATO, which has been mentioned in a couple of the questions already. If Britain's commitment in Ukraine is limited by the fact that it has no vital interest in Ukrainian sovereignty in the terms that Patrick has set out, I mean, one of the questions said, are we seriously saying we should contemplate nuclear war to defend Ukraine? To which of course the answer is yes, if it's a vital interest, and therefore no, right? What makes the NATO members that also border Russia different to Ukraine in that context? Would Britain have a different set of interests in the event of a Russian move against a NATO member, or would we wind up seeing some similar dynamics playing out where Britain and other NATO states would be looking to limit their liabilities, and it would really ultimately be down to those countries to defend themselves, albeit with some support? I'm going to ask Elke to respond first, so I can keep shaking the order up.
Okay, thanks. I will answer your first question. I think it's a really interesting question, you know, the sense perhaps by which the status quo as it is useful for some others. And I have a provocative answer, and, you know, I want the audience to take this with a pinch of salt, but I do want to highlight the fact that there are certain benefactors of what is happening in the Ukraine at the moment. And there are certain industries that have popped up which capitalize on an ongoing conflict in the Ukraine. And that is specifically because the Ukraine serves as a pipeline to test new technologies, right? So in order to produce new defense technologies, whether that is new types of drones or other types of digitally enabled systems, or any kind of like new innovative startup products, having a pipeline to an active conflict in order to test these products, and in order to then kind of refine them and iterate them and improve them, in order then to be able to either gain contracts or at least bolster one's valuation or attractiveness to investors. It's a thing, right? We can't necessarily ignore the fact that the Ukraine has become a laboratory for testing new defense technologies. And various private equity funded kind of pipelines have popped up that capitalize on this. And sometimes I do wonder what would happen if all hostilities were to cease. What happens to those industries that are built, and the returns for which can only materialize if they continue to grow, the startups, if all of that is built on having an active conflict like in the Ukraine. Now, this is a big provocation, and I'm not saying, you know, people are definitely interested in having war in order to test their products, but it's a relationship and a logic that we should take into account when we think about the new defense ecology that is driven or that is financed by a financing model that needs fast growth. And in order to achieve that fast growth, you need to be able to test your weapons in an active conflict. I'm happy to explain that more, but this is the sort of thing that I've been working on. So I do wonder to what degree there's conflicting or you know, interests that are in tension. But I can tell you for sure that those Ukrainians that I talk to about this do not want to be in a position where they're a testing bed, or where they are seen to be the frontier for innovation and new defense technology. They just want the war to end.
Thanks, Elke. Patrick.
I'm supposed to say the kind of bloody-minded, ruthless, awful thing here, but may I argue instead that having this crisis is, on balance, not good for our interests, because it's a crisis that could result in the unthinkable. And it's a very grave set of risks that we're managing. And it's quite intense, and things could go very wrong. And whatever other interests, benefits, disadvantages flow, that has to be the overarching hard truth here. If we could have the best tomorrow and Russia were to withdraw, cede all ground without a high-risk escalation, we would have been warned in due time anyway about what could happen in future. And we could take those lessons, the need for mass, quantity, the resilience of a defense industrial base, that not everything in the future is qualitative, that in fact, contrary to what was said by the Defense Command paper years ago, mass, quantity, resilience really matters. Having a defense industrial base that can function, built around resilience, not just efficiency, having a technically skilled workforce, having stockpiles of munitions, all of those things. Secondly, we would have been warned about the possibility of war, actual war, not just kind of little green men, sort of all that very clever sort of overblown paradigm a few years ago. No, this can return. But to get to your other question, James, because I don't want to be accused of ducking it. If Ukraine, why not Poland? I think that once Russia starts extending its influence and control further west, you get too close to Germany. It's a matter of hard geopolitical where the power lies. And Germany is a power center within Europe, despite all of its problems. But that points us to a further reality we have to get to grips with, which is not being talked about enough. that in a future crisis where Russia tests NATO itself directly, you wouldn't want to bet on NATO responding as a unity. In fact, what you're likely to get is coalitions from within NATO responding while others pull out. Because Article 5, technically speaking, is a nothing burger. It commits you to nothing other than to doing what is necessary. It's from declaring war on behalf of someone else to meeting for tea to express your concerns. And so what we need to do then, in the time that is being bought here, is to prepare coalitions much more intensively. The distribution of labour, the division of labour between different countries, and Britain with the militarily serious states, from Poland especially important, I think, for a number of reasons, Finland, France, etc., what that coalition would look like, to prepare for that kind of reality as well, that European defence will remain critical, even if NATO institutionally, formally is paralysed. That's enough for now, I think.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the technical term nothing burger, which we hadn't yet introduced into the discussion. Evie.
I very much agree, particularly with those final points from Patrick, which is that, to me, I think if we were looking to a conflict in another NATO country, was, the very fact that it's NATO would trigger more response. That's, inevitable, but I don't think it would be a coherent response, much more coherent than the current response that we've had to Ukraine. And so we face a situation where that really undermines the integrity of NATO. And, realistically, it would partly depend on, who is the US president at the time, who are the leaders in Europe at the time, who is willing to step up. Because if, for example, this was to happen in 4 years' time, you've got a new US president that's much more engaged in NATO, maybe it's a bit more positive looking. But without that, if it was, 2 years' time, he's left Ukraine and suddenly he's invaded Estonia, we are better equipped. The UK has troops in Estonia. We are, better placed as a starting point. But I don't think our response would be fundamentally much more coherent than it has been on Ukraine. We'd see a prolonged conflict where we would piecemeal, provide support. And I think it's especially notable that, the Ukraine crisis has used up political energy for supporting European security. Whilst it's, galvanized it in many ways, it has also, it's depleted resources, it's depleted political capital. And so, somewhere like Estonia, which for many Brits particularly feels quite far away, it's going to be very hard to then mobilize them around another conflict again to say, oh, well, we supported Ukraine for 4 years. It was all quite long, it spent quite a lot of money. We didn't really enjoy it. Oh, we're going to do it again. And actually, realistically, if he invades somewhere else, we may do it again and again and again. I'm not sure that's something that's going to be easy for, government to sell. And so it's a difficult challenge that I think we face on that side. I think the provocative question of whether the end of the war is actually good is one I hadn't thought about particularly, partly because it's such an sort of in many ways unthinkable question. Of course you want the war to end, but I do think the question of whether it distracts Russia is a counterfactual. It's very hard to answer, but actually is a really interesting question of, has the way the West has responded to the Ukraine war done enough to deter Russia from invading other countries? Probably not. So whilst he's focused on Russia, is it good that he's not then focusing on other countries? Partly that would depend on how well other countries could respond, whether those countries were in NATO, how much of a NATO response you would get. But I definitely think it's one for us to think about moving forward. And I also think thinking about it in the context of the world as well, where the UK and Europe are focused a lot on Ukraine, rightly, but it has meant we haven't focused on conflicts elsewhere in the world. We haven't focused particularly, for example, on China for a while. We haven't, there's conflicts all over the world that we're not thinking about, which are being implicated by our focus on Ukraine. So it's not just whether Russia would not invade in Europe, it's also what's happening in the rest of the world as well.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to make some more comments and try and bring in some more of the questions that we've had in the chat and in the Q&A. Something I find really interesting about the whole context of the war, which we've touched upon in the discussions, we had successive UK national security strategies that really downplayed state-level threats as things we should be concerned about. And obviously, for obvious reasons, that has shifted in the most recent strategic defense review. But nevertheless, we did have a series of these strategies saying state level threats, not really a big thing, don't really need to worry too much about that. And obviously that's reflected in, for example, the reduced size of Britain's conventional armed forces and the way that that has been brought down over time. I'd like to ask the panel to reflect on two questions, which is, I suppose, on the one hand, What lessons should the UK be taking from the war in Ukraine in terms of its own future preparedness? And secondly, to what extent do you think it's actually capable of learning those lessons? What do you think are the barriers? It strikes me that one of the things that's really interesting about this conflict is that it's both a return to a very kind of 20th century form of war where we're worried about munitions production. Right. I wasn't the first one to mention the First World War, so I'm going to continue with that and say one of the big challenges in the early months of the First World War was the sheer volume of artillery shells being used on the Western Front and the capacity to keep up with production demand. It was a huge, huge issue. It was a major contributor to the first political crisis of the war. We've got that in Ukraine, and we've also got this use of drones or unmanned vehicles. I think drones tends to imply a level of sophistication that they don't have, that has led to both innovations in technology and in tactics, or at least changes in technology and tactics that are very much not that kind of conventional rows of trenches and rows of artillery. So I'm really interested to think what the panel think are the key lessons to take away, and then what potential is there for Britain to actually learn those lessons. I'm going to ask Patrick first.
Thanks for asking. Well, it's difficult because one very linear lesson that many folk draw already in the papers is we have to spend more on defense. We've got to muscle up. We've got to get militarily robust, 4, 5, 6% GDP, educate the people. This is a time of war. Get people ready for kind of civil defense exercises. Well, there's a kind of unreality about that because Vladimir Putin, whilst I do think he menaces European security, is not Uncle Joe Stalin with 150 divisions parked on the lawn, or Adolf Hitler capable of overrunning the continent quickly. It is the case that someone has to do some balancing, and we have to help lead that. But you're simply not going to get that kind of intense mobilization. Evie's absolutely right to say that were things to get more serious and were a predator like Putin's regime to start threatening NATO countries, British support for defense might ramp up, then it's too late, because capabilities needed in 10 years' time need to be start building now. These are long lead times. The preparation time is long. So you're dealing with a dangerous situation, but with quite constraining budgets, ceilings, both in terms of budgets and in terms of public opinion. So that I would suggest two things, therefore, unpleasant things. First of all, if we actually can't be too capital intensive to the point we'd like, that puts even more stress on the importance of coalitions and building coalitions now. Secondly, there's a problem here. It's about nuclear deterrence. One of the reasons this war in Ukraine has more or less been confined to Ukraine in terms of the hard fighting has been nuclear deterrence in the background. But that in itself presupposes America's shoulders to the wheel with its vast arsenal. That might not be as sure in the future. We have a problem with non-American nuclear credibility. When I say credibility, I mean believability. There is a fatal gap in the escalation ladder that Britain can bring to any conflict. We're confronted with a crisis where Russia has a whole suite of nuclear weapons of different sizes and ranges and yields, where Britain is faced with the choice between surrendering and going all the way to Armageddon instantly with no intermediate capacity to retaliate credibly. So we're going to have to think about, if we can't create a gigantic massed force or the budgets we want, to actually making a non-US nuclear deterrent credible in conjunction with others, and in working within the political realities that we are presented with. It's not a nice constraint, but then again, it's not a nice world.
Thank you. Elke.
Thank you. Yeah, lots to think about. I completely agree, actually, with the way forward through building coalitions and taking seriously the nuclear factor, that is such a crucial part in this conflict. I would also say that we should be very, very careful not to overfit what is happening in Ukraine, in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, onto any future conflicts. In some ways, we can learn from this conflict in terms of military technology and tactics. And plans, strategies associated with that, but I would be very cautious. And most observers say what we're seeing in Ukraine is not likely what the wars of the future are going to be. Many observers even say the wars of the future are going to be conducted very much in urban environments and not open fields, So a different kind of technology and a different kind of like pipeline of technology would be required. It's also not necessarily the case that the innovations that we're seeing right now will be particularly sustainable, right? We've already seen it in the beginning of the war. We all thought a certain type of drone will be extremely effective, and it was for a certain period of time until Russia mimicked the same thing. And then you had this like whack-a-mole ratcheting up of innovation, counter innovation, throw a net over the tank to spoof this or that or the other. So it's important not to take what we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia and the conflict and the technology that comes out of that as a blueprint for potential success in the future. I think that's risky, and that is making us potentially blind to other ways of preventing conflict in the first place, right? So I do think there's a risk that if you turn your economy into a wartime economy and you capitalize on a defense dividend, and you kind of fashion yourself after, something that is not yet there in peace times, and in doing so, you're taking funds away from other factors that would provide domestic stability and security, then you are leaving yourself a lot more vulnerable than otherwise. So that's my word of caution.
Thank you. And Evie.
I just wanted to quickly build on Elke's point, which was to say that, and it's not just the domestic, I don't think that compromises get made, but also the international, and particularly to the aid budget, for example. And if we focus so much on security and defence, we often don't think about prevention, for which international development particularly is a key part of the conversation that I think in this world that feels much more hard, we've kind of stopped thinking about, stopped prioritizing. And there's work to be done to better make the links between development and security, but they can be made, and I think that's worth thinking about. In terms of lessons from Ukraine, I think there's a few, and there's some that we have learned better than others. I think if we look at the Strategic Defence Review, there's been a big push towards the NATO first, European-focused defence policy. I think that's good. I think that reflects where the UK is in the world, where the US is, and kind of where we can realistically position and be most useful. So I think that has been really effective. I think the move away from a focus on terrorism, which had kind of it'd been the big thing in the public domain for a while, and that's what everyone was focusing on, obviously still important, but moving towards state-based threats in a kind of more multipolar world, I think is, reflects the reality that we're living in and has been seen in the SDR. And then I think the other kind of key lessons from Ukraine has been around this kind of tech-enabled defense power, which is kind of the language used again in the SDR. I think in some ways we're well prepared. The UK has a very thriving science ecosystem. We aren't always very good at using it, but I think there are opportunities there. I would say that the real challenge to me is that I think, where Ukraine has done well is it has been agile, it's been ahead of Russia when it comes to tech and innovation. That will be key, and it may or may not be as key in other conflicts as it has been here, but it will still always be important. And I don't think, the UK's MOD is something you would ever really describe as agile. And there are lessons there, I think, for us on kind of how do we create a system that is much more flexible, movable, and can change with the changing nature of conflict, because actually, even in a war in 5 years' time, the way it is being conducted will be very different. And also, just to echo the kind of point around coalitions and partnerships, I also wrote it down immediately when the question was asked, where to me, I think we have learned a bit. I think the SDR and even the sort of second version of the integrated review shifted more towards partnership. I think we've increasingly recognised the UK can't do it alone. I don't know that we always have the most kind of partners that want to lead and be at the forefront, and that will be kind of on the UK in many ways to do a lot of that, particularly within NATO. But realistically, they will be key to our response to Ukraine, but also beyond as well.
Great, thank you very much. We've just got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to make sure that we've asked all of the questions that we've imposed. So we had one question asking, if Ukraine is the Silicon Valley of defence technology, how does the UK capitalise on this as part of our 100-year partnership? We had another question asking, is the worst possible outcome that there's a return to the Cold War status quo, but without splitting up Germany? We also had a question about NATO preparedness to respond to a Russian attack, given the relatively weak responses to violation of airspace so far. To which I wanted to tack on a question which I'd be interested in the panelists' views. Is there a risk that we are overemphasizing the Russian threat? And what I mean is, I think that we've seen very clearly Russia's intent and willingness to conduct this kind of operation. At the same time, to my mind, it doesn't say anything good about Russia's capacity that it didn't just roll into Kyiv in the first days of the war. That the analysts who thought this would be a quick and easy Russian victory were incorrect. Russia's spending 8% of its GDP on defense and security at the moment, but that GDP is roughly the size of Italy's and is significantly less than the combined resources of Western Europe, if only those resources could be marshaled and directed in the right kind of way. So I'll ask the panelists to respond to some of those things as you see fit, and any final comments you want to make. We've just got a few minutes left. I'll ask Elke to go first.
Yes, thanks so much. I don't think the Ukraine is the Silicon Valley of defense technology. Silicon Valley is the Silicon Valley of defense technology, or rather the US remains the most significant player, followed by some European countries, companies rather, startup companies. But most of them financed, or a lot of them financed through US venture capital financing. So Ukraine plays a really important role in being able to test and try out and better understand the dynamics of conflict for some of these startups and some of those products. And of course, it has a really thriving defense tech environment, but it is very much responsive to this particular war. And so it's not necessarily a new kind of, Silicon Valley type ecosystem. For a number of reasons. So, the premise of the question isn't quite right for me, but I do think that the UK is seeking to capitalize on this dynamic. At least that's what I read into those strategies, in which this role of venture capital plays a more significant role, and which I don't think we've thought through, given the dynamics of who stands to gain the most, as we've seen in the involvement of venture capital in the last 2 decades of Silicon Valley products being wielded onto us.
Thank you. To put it another way, if there are risks in getting someone else to fight your wars for you, there are also risks in getting someone else to pay for your new military technologies for you. Patrick, final thoughts.
The Russia threat is one of the hardest conundrums. It's neither a 10-foot giant nor is it a mosquito. It's in fact, its GDP is more realistically the size of Germany's if you take into account purchasing power parity. So even on those terms, it's bigger in its capacity to get bang for the buck than some we might think. Secondly, the reason it stalled and faltered and was thrown back outside Kyiv was that it had the right hook being provided by US satellite reconnaissance intelligence, which might not be provided in future. We need time to build our own version of that. Right? Russia stalled in Ukraine, not just because of Russian inaptitude, although that was real, but because it was determinedly opposed by other powers wielding major war capabilities. Nothing automatic about this. Wars are not won by GDP. The country that had the highest GDP in the world in the 19th century was China. Look what happened to it. So we have to get real in turning Europe's latent strength into actual strength. And to do that, that is directly linked to the crisis in Ukraine now. And by the way, hope Australia wins the Ashes. Just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thanks for getting that little dig in. Evie, final word from you.
I also just wanted to touch on that last question: are we overstating the Russia threat? I think it is a really hard one to assess, partly because understanding Russia's intentions is always kind of tricky, and that's as much determined by its domestic position as its international posture, and where Putin's mind is at domestically. I would also say, while the Russia threat may be less than people kind of talk about, the challenge is our response to it. And I think Ukraine has shown that whilst there will always be some degree of support from Europe and South solidarity, it will not be enough, particularly without the US, to provide long-term support that would end or finish a war. And so that's our real challenge, is that actually, Russia doesn't have to be that big of a threat if Europe itself isn't prepared to respond to Russia. And I think that's the kind of big question and conundrum we have to address.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I want to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists for a fascinating discussion. A huge thank you to those of you in the audience and watching the recording later on. If you've enjoyed this session and you're not already signed up to the Mile End Institute mailing list, please sign up using the link in the chat. And if you'd like to view Sir Lawrence Freedman's Hennessy lecture, which inspired this discussion, you can see it now on the Mile End Institute YouTube channel. With that, we will say thank you very much. Have a great afternoon and do join us again. Bye-bye.